Good morning. My name is Stam. I'm the extension agent for the Seminole tribe, and today I just want to talk to you a little bit about some of the things that we've been doing with smutgrass that might fall outside of Dr. Sellers' realm. But really, there are a couple things that I have to say about what I've been doing there. And the first is kind of a thank you to Alex Johns. He's a guy that we had some discussion about smutgrass. And I came in as a pretty new extension agent growing up in Iowa, and I had no preconceived notions about smutgrass. So that's kind of been a blessing to me that I didn't come in and say, well, I've got to do this. It felt like a real overwhelming problem when I got there, and everybody said, what are we going to do about this? And so I got to think a little outside the box, and then we got some numbers that went along with that. So I'm going to go over those now. But I'm thankful to Alex and the resources he provided that let us go ahead with this. So most of the time when I first started, I moved to Florida from, believe it or not, Maine. And one of my first questions was, I was with a producer and he said, well, what are we going to do about that smutgrass? And I said, well, I don't know. That's a great question. And so I think this is pretty typical of what the pastures we were seeing both on the Brighton Reservation and the Big Cypress Reservation look like, that we had overgrazed bahia scattered through clumps of smutgrass that were virtually worthless, right? I think that's why just about everybody is here, that you see the smutgrass in that condition and it has no value to a cow. There's no value at all associated with that, not to mention the stress that the bahia grass underneath is under. And the carrying capacity of that ground just isn't high. So that's what we started with, and we said, we've got to take some steps. And this is just a quick picture of one of the pastures I was in that Brent talked a little bit about the two different varieties of smutgrass. We've seen our giant smutgrass respond very well to fertilizer and aeration. And I was out in a pasture, and one of my producers, he said, what the heck is this? And I said, man, you've done a fine job of fertilizing and aerating. That's some healthy smutgrass. And again, he wasn't too impressed with my response on that, but I said, it was 6 feet tall plus, and there's a whole lot of volume in that grass, and I guess I'll talk about that a little bit in a while as well. So really, what I come down to a lot of folks is when they ask me about what we've been doing, I say there's an economic threshold to everything. And that is, smutgrass grazing certainly isn't going to be for everyone. If you've renovated pastures and spent thousands of dollars in killing smutgrass, I have good friends that I eat dinner with every Wednesday and Thursday night who have basically told me, they hate what I'm doing. And I said, okay, and I get it. They've been killing smutgrass for a long time, and I'm a little outspoken to be a contrarian. So I twist it a little bit, but smutgrass grazing is not for everyone. There's an economic threshold where you have to look at it and say, excuse me, when does it stop being a weed and when does it start being a forage? And that's a decision everybody's going to have to make. The Seminole tribe had tried, the reason why this got started, they had tried a lot of different methods to kill smutgrass on a lot of different acreages, and they had problems. They would get it under control in an area, it would come back, and there were 67 different producers for the tribe that were applying different management strategies. So it became something that a lot of things were tried, and basically in the end, as it stands right now, we're not applying any herbicide unless that one of the 67 owners wants to, but the cattle program has just stopped for right now. So if you decide to start treating it like a forage, and that's really what had happened, we said there aren't a whole lot of management strategies that are out there for once you treat it like a forage, that if it's a management issue, we felt like we needed to get some parameters around that and what it would look like. So really how this started was several years ago. I was still a pretty new extension agent, and I work every year with the tribe during their cattle shipping. And we noticed that the Brighton Reservation usually ships calves right after the week after the 4th of July. And some of the bigger calves coming in from producers were coming off of pastures that were almost predominantly were primarily smutgrass, that there were lots of heavily infested pastures. And we just kind of made note of it as we were in the pens. That was, man, there's a lot of big calves coming in from places we wouldn't have thought of. And then we got down to Big Cypress, and a guy named Robert Cypress, everybody there calls him Bush, he had the biggest calves that came through that shipping, and he is almost 100% covered up with smut grass. And I know why it's not 100%, underneath that clump. We know that there's still grass underneath there. There's Bahia, there's Bermuda, but Bush had some significantly larger calves than some other folks. And so Alex looked at me and he said, I think we need to take a ride over to Bush's pasture and see what he's doing. And we got over there, and basically what he was doing was when he had some time, he would get on his tractor and he would mow. And he would mow not at any set rate for any length of time that we could tell, but he was mowing strips in his smutgrass pastures. And then his cows were going back and self-selecting the young, tender smutgrass. And I know that's not a mystery to most of you, that cows will eat it while it's young, but once it gets, we had kind of thought at that time the premise was once it makes a seed head, cows won't eat it. And that was where we had decided to call it. If it had a seed head, it's not palatable, it's worthless. And we've kind of seen different results of that. So we just watched as over the next year or so and saw cows were self-selecting. And so I was tasked with saying, in a cow owners meeting, one of the folks there said, Aaron, what are you going to do about this? And I kind of gave him the response about Velpar and what the application rates were. And his response to me is, I think you're lazy. And where I grew up, the L word was about as bad of a four-letter word as you could be called. So I took that as a real challenge and just started to say, okay, I needed to quantify not having any real experience with it. What were the things that could be done to it? Where did it come from? So we looked at it very quickly and said, I know we can burn it. We know we can burn it once it reaches there. We can mow it. We can treat it with a herbicide. We can intensively graze it, and then we can treat it with a roller chopper. And we'd seen lots of folks, Foreman in Big Cypress at the time was a big believer that the roller chopper method would help control the clump size, as well as he thought was also reducing the total amount of smut grass in a pasture. So those were basically the 5 things that we had looked at. And I come back to Bush and Bush's pasture. We kind of said, we need to prove what's going on in Bush's pasture. So we reached out to some folks. Diamond R donated some cages to use. NRCS donated some collection hoops. Seminole Tribe gave us the locations to do a couple of experiments on. And basically what we did was created an environment where we wanted to test a complete fertilizer, which was 25-0-10, and a liquid nitrogen and Grazing X, and then a control strip, just to see what we were going to get as far as really, we did look at volumes, but our data on that wasn't quite as what we had hoped. So I don't put a lot of faith in it. But what we wanted to look at was crude protein, TDN, and the nutritional value of that smutgrass. And I know it's probably hard to see, but in those squares, what we decided was after fertilization, we sampled at 14 days, 21 days, 28 days, and 42 days. We thought that 42-day would certainly be at a time when that grass wasn't palatable for a cow. It was in full seed head. The exclusion cages we used were just like that. It was the metal frame from liquid containers. We wrapped each one of those in chicken wire to make sure that little bunny rabbits wouldn't get in there and throw off our data. And that's one of the things about an exclusion cage, that if you're doing things, it doesn't take much to disappear out of that cage to make a difference. So we tried to make sure there wasn't anything that could happen to get in there. We measured every week just the height of our clumps. As I said, we had divided each cage into basically quadrants where we're going to measure that grass. There's Lindsay Wiggins measuring some grass. This picture right there, I really just wanted to show as an example of what the smutgrass in Big Cypress. This is Robert Cypress's pasture, and there's just hundreds of acres of solid smutgrass right there. If you look in the background, it is hundreds of acres of smutgrass that has gone to seed head. And at that point in time, giving his stocking rate, there isn't much longer that smutgrass is going to have any value for those cows. He's close to losing it all right there. So with our study on smutgrass nutrition, basically what we saw was on Mr. Cypress's ground where we used liquid fertilizer only. Our crude protein was 13.8%. That's a composite result of that 14, 21, 28, and 42 days. We took samples of each one of those, sent them off, and then that was the composite average of that. The dry fertilizer, and I'm sorry I said 25-0-10, that was what we put out this year. Sorry, Marshall Coker. that we had used the 20-0-10, and we put that out at a rate of 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So that crude protein was at 14.5% with the TDN just over 57. And then our control, where we didn't put any sort of fertilizer or herbicide out there, was about 12% crude protein. And this was in the spring. So I want to be clear on that there is some protein associated with that in the spring flush of that grass. The protein in this we've seen is highly variable over the year, but we were pretty excited. So on the second location where we did that, it was a pasture that the board of directors of the Seminole tribe had control of. We saw that liquid nitrogen only on there really spiked our average. We had some samples come back as high as 23% crude protein. The dry fertilizer was again close to 18% protein, as well as in the control, the non-fertilized was almost 14.5% with pretty good values on the TDN. So we felt like after we were all done there, we said, we think we at least understand why bush had big calves. They were eating fresh smut grass that had some real nutrition to it. So basically at that point, we said, what are we going to do with this data? It makes sense that we believe there's some value in that smut grass, and I love analogies, so I said I think the smut grass is kind of like a banana, that it has some value when it's too young, when there's not enough volume out there. It could be pretty good, but there's not enough to it. So we really looked at about that 21-day time frame when we looked at our results and said we have good volume of grass, pretty good nutritional qualities, and started to say if we could get cows out there to capture that smut grass in that 21 to 28-day time frame, I think we might be on to something. So I asked Alex Johns for 40 heifers, and I got 40 heifers. They came from the Miccosukee land lease that the tribe had, and they were wild. They were crazy when they came up to Brighton. They were as wild as any animals I'd seen, but we decided that we were going to start what I call Pasture X. And as a kid growing up in Iowa, I always heard about Lake X somewhere in Florida for Mercury Marine, and I thought that was the coolest thing ever. So I wanted to have Pasture X as my experiment. And so basically what we did with Pasture X is we took 39, we started with 40 head. One of them, she was crazy. She got hot the day we brought her back to Brighton. She ran off in the woods. The dogs got on her. She ran around, got crazy, and she disappeared. And I think she could be still out on the range somewhere. We're in heaven. I don't know. But she disappeared. So we went immediately to 39 head. And the 20 acres I took, there was approximately 80 to 100% smut grass coverage. I don't know, without going out there and mapping every square inch of it, I can tell you that it was pretty well covered up with smut grass. And it's real tough to see, but we had looked at a place that we wanted to say, it was a smut grass study. So we took as heavy of an infestation as we could find. We went ahead and I got a fence crew in there. We took that 20 acres and changed it into 4 5-acre paddocks. And really at the start of this, we just wanted to see if there would be a good interaction from the animal to the smut grass. That was basically when we started. We wanted to say, can these cows in a rotational basis eat smut grass and have value to the grass? And then it's grown into a little bit more than that, but that was the very simple concept that we started with. And so again, we started out with 2-year-old heifers that came from Miccosukee. We had some things that had to happen on Pasture X. There wasn't a lot of water. I only have one water source. So the NRCS had years ago put out a first-generation solar well. I had to trench lines in the ground. We put out 2 tubs that are split between my paddock 1 and 2 and paddocks 3 and 4. I had some folks mow that grass, the smut grass, before the animals went out there. So the first paddock that they had 7 days on had exactly 21 days worth of growth of smut grass on it before the heifers were turned out onto it. When we got them, they were flighty at best. They were scared of their own shadow. They would see my truck, hear my truck, and head to the woods. They did not like me. I scored them as they came through the chute at our shipping pins when we first received them. And on average, their body condition score was a little under 4. So they were a little lighter than we would want. Right away, we understood that there are some challenges associated with what I called competitive rotational grazing. We saw a tighter, I like to talk about my problems first so that they're out there. The first thing we saw right away is that we had 2 animals per acre. We saw that that was a little bit increased fly load on those animals. And there's about 1,000 acre pasture around me where the tribe develops heifers. We saw that my area probably had a slightly higher fly load than the heifers that surrounded me. We think that was probably due to the increased animal presence. We also think that maybe my neighboring heifers around us like to come over, and we were subject to some of the flies that came from them. Again, water, if anytime that you look at a system that involves paddocks, you have to have the infrastructure there. And so we had an old solar pump, an old motor. We had to replace the motor on it. The next problem we had was shade. So I had to utilize some shade structures that were built on skis to move in and out of some of my paddocks. Some of my paddocks had, at least 2 of my paddocks had no shade at all. One of them had very little, whereas one of them, instead of being 5 acres of grass, is really about 3.5 acres of grass. The other is mostly woods. And then probably the other biggest challenge that I had was as growing up I can remember my grandfather looking at where cows were standing and he's saying, there's still good grass under their feet. I had to do away with that mentality as I looked at that. I had to be looking at where they were going next. I couldn't look at what they were standing on and let what was in front of them get rank and unpalatable. So that was a challenge for me. As I said, they were a little bit flighty. We started off with, I got 1.5 tons of field cubes. The first couple of days I went out there, I'd honk my horn, dump a couple bags of cubes. The heifers would run to the woods. I'd dump the cubes on the ground, go back to my truck, drive away, and they would slowly emerge out. And after a couple of weeks, we kind of gentled them down, and we saw that they were slowly starting to get accustomed to me. And I've got pictures in there just to kind of show you there's nothing special about these cows. They were commercial Brangus. Some of them have a little bit more ear than others. There's a few of them that are a little more English than I would like to see in a pasture in South Florida, but they're just a very basic commercial Brangus operation. So there was one of the cows that actually, I don't know why I liked her. She was my favorite cow. She was open the first year and ended up breeding as a 3-year-old, and I was glad she did because it was going to hurt me to send her away. I still don't know why I like her, but anyway. So the competitive rotational grazing theory on smutgrass, there were a couple of premises. We started out with that premise that cattle stocked at a higher density are going to more efficiently graze the forage that's available. More cows on less acres leads to what I call the competitive grazing environment. And my other analogy for people is if you brought me to a buffet or a couple of fat kids to a buffet, you gave them all day at the buffet and said, eat whatever you want, they're going to cherry pick pizza, pudding, stuff like that. If you say you've got 10 minutes to get your food and then you're done, that competitive nature, they're going to fill their plates. We believe those cows in an environment where they're stocked at a heavy rate begin to graze a little bit heavier. They feel that grazing beside them of their neighbor, and it's a competitive situation. They want to eat. They're less selective. We saw that they were eating dollarweed. My ragweed was disappeared. Really, the weeds that we had that they wouldn't eat were thistle, soda apple, pigweed, things like that. But we just know that our weeds were consumed at a much greater rate than in that competitive rotational system than without. So we assumed smutgrass. We had to take some assumptions on this that may or may not have cost the tribe money. We assumed that nutritionally smutgrass could carry the herd at 2 cows to an acre. We weren't sure, but we knew that some places, some of our producers had been told, you've got a lot of smutgrass, put out 1 cow to 5 acres. That's what you ought to be doing if you've got smutgrass, to make sure she's got enough forage out there. What that did, in my opinion, in my very simple opinion, is it allowed smutgrass to take a strong foothold. It gained a competitive advantage. The bahia that was there became overgrazed. The smutgrass went to seed and began to spread. And I think that's kind of how, as people reduced the number of cows on acres, that's how smutgrass started to spread. Our bahia grass being so good for so long let people leave cows in certain pastures longer and longer. One of the things that we also knew, we needed to leave our molasses out. We use sugar lick as both our supplementation and our mineral package went through there. I also had a cost as 2-year-olds. I followed the tribe's protocol for developing heifers. And so the one thing I didn't want to do is just get completely out of line with what the tribe has done for a lot of years in developing their heifers. So very customary for them that they'll feed for 60 days on 2-year-olds. They breed all 2-year-olds, no yearlings until this year. There were a couple yearlings bred this year, but traditionally they breed 2-year-olds. And so our feeding in Brighton for those heifers would look like 60 days before bulls go in, their feed that goes out. We used a Walpole feed. It was called Likes Brothers number 7. And that was just something that, and then 30 days after the bulls came in, we removed those feeders from there. Our goal was to take those animals. They had improved in their body condition score from that 3.9. They were probably about a 4.2, 4.3 when I did the average. Our goal was to get them to a 5, and they did that. They probably overconsumed what I need them to on that feeder. We ended up figuring our cost of gain was about 55 cents a pound, so we felt pretty good on that. There is my first year feeding out there. We used the feeders. One of the things that had happened is the gates on my feeder were up all the way when they got started out there. They were over-consuming. I called Jay Walpole and I said, hey man, they're eating way more than they're supposed to be. And he said, go check your gates, Aaron. And so as I did, they were in there. They had their heads thrashing around. There was feed everywhere. We had a couple of hog issues that we asked some tribal members to come. The hogs were quickly dispatched. And then my consumption per day really fell back into where it should have been. But that first 30 days, I saw a higher rate than what I'd expected. This is just kind of a fall grazing picture that, again, pictures are more exciting than hearing me talk. You can see the smutgrass there. Those yearlings are nothing special. But that first year, as we got ready for bulls to go in, we utilized half-blood bulls. And I did not make the call on what bulls were going to go in. That was chosen by the cattle foreman in Brighton. I was pleased with those young half-blooded bulls that went in. I had 39 head that came into my pasture that were truly part of my study. They put out 3 bulls, which was probably a little heavy on the bull service. And when we look at some of my costs, that first year, my bull costs were a little higher than what I would have liked. But they were, the idea was that 2 bulls were going to be fighting and one of them was going to be working. And so that wasn't necessarily wrong, but we had pretty good success. So in that, the first year, we did our pregnancy check on 5/21, and we had 39 heifers out there. I had one of the neighbors, a gentleman named Norman Johns, one of his girls jumped the fence and got in with mine, so I did have a total of 40. Out of the total 40 that were there, 37 of them were bred, so they were called bred. Out of the 3 that weren't, which I just thought was interesting, Dr. Liz Steele said that one of them had ovarian follicular dysplasia on both sides, and 2 of the heifers had immature tracts. So I guess one of the things that I don't like using about reproductive status as an indicator of nutritional quality is that I would like to just be looking at body condition score. Like, was this grass able to feed these animals? But in the real world, a cow-calf operation is going to say, did she breed or not? And so 37 out of the 40 were bred, put my conception rate on smutgrass, 2 cows to the acre at 93%. I was shocked, to say the least, that had happened. So as we started our calving season, Mr. Norman's, when we preg checked, Mr. Norman's heifer went back home with him, so I lost her. And so then I was back to 39 heifers in the pasture. My first calf was born October 11th of 2018. I had 78% of my calves were on the ground in the first 32 days of calving season. Now, I don't feel like that's a significant number that I can say, well, hey, this is something, other than I felt like that those heifers were in good body condition score when the bulls went out. And some people are going to say, well, that was because you fed them. And I said, yeah, there was definitely feed in there. But I think Alex Johns would agree with me. My heifers were probably half of a body condition score to 1 full body condition score better than the tribe's heifers that surrounded me. So we felt like there was something definitely to the rotational strategies. Out of those pregnant, out of the the cows that were pregnant, I had 35 calves born. One heifer died while she was giving birth, and then I had one calf that was born a full month early, and then one was born kind of 2 weeks after the calving season should have closed. And both of those animals were born alive, but both of them died very shortly. So one of the things that, as we've been looking at mycotoxins and issues, we've wanted to make sure that we didn't have abortions or losses early on. So we were very excited that as we look at ergots and things that could be in the grasses, we said we were excited that we didn't have any unknown calving losses. So one of the concerns when you put animals out in a competitive rotational environment like this, it's great because your input costs per acre are very low. It's bad because if you get dry and the grass shuts down, you can get in a bad situation in a hurry. So I had these cows that were now, come January 4th of this year, the average body condition score of those cows after calving had fallen to a 3.5 to 4. I was very concerned because they weren't my cattle. They were the Seminole tribe's cattle. And I said, I begged Alex, basically, I said, I feel like we need to early wean these calves. And I'm afraid that that's going to impact the study in a way that I would have really liked to have carried them all the way to weaning. But I also feel like if it's not my animal to negatively impact, I really felt strongly that I didn't want to get myself in a bad situation. Ended up February 20th, we went ahead and weaned those calves. And so we did early wean. And I'm going to kind of skip ahead. After those were weaned, we put feed back in this year. We fed again for 45 days this time before the bulls went out, and then 45 days after the bulls were in. I had 30 with the one heifer that died, so we just preg checked on the 5th. Out of those 38 animals, we had a 95% conception rate, so we felt pretty good about that. This year I had reduced my number of bulls from 3 to 2. I thought that was more appropriate. Our breeding season had gone from approximately January 15th to April 15th. And so that day on the 5th, on June 5th, as we went through the pregnancy check-in, Pasture X was done. And I said, oh man, what am I going to do now? And fortunately for me, that question didn't last very long. That coming up on the 19th of July, we're going to be receiving approximately 80 4-weight heifers that are going to come in, and we're going to be looking at just what competitive rotational grazing on development on a heifer can do. So again, it's going to be exciting just to kind of test this theory that we can carry some quite a few head per acre if we manage it correctly. I did want to share some costs because last time I talked here at Smutgrass Field Day, somebody said, boy, you didn't share all your costs, and he was right. And so I've got all my books today because basically the reason why we did this was to see if there was something out there that could help Florida ranchers make a dollar. And I have combined many of my line items into some very basic things up there, but you'll see my veterinary expenses were a little less this year. My mowing stayed constant. My fertilizer and spreading, again, that was 50 pounds of nitrogen going out per acre. My feed cost, that is my feed that went out in those feeders, was a little higher as a 3-year-olds as they were shedding teeth, as well as my molasses with the mineral package. My costs went up on that. Apparently my labor has gone up as well. We do have depreciation on equipment as a cost in there. We don't depreciate the cows. The tribe has always said that is something for each cattle owner and their accountant to do, so I didn't take any depreciation on the cows. Each year you can see my total heifer costs for the first year were $13,363. The second year we jumped up a couple $1,000s. My bull costs, I used basically the same, the same format. The veterinary expenses, the mowing, I had all of those into the bull development. That's typically for tribal cattle producers, something that the tribe charges them. So on my bull costs, that was just reflective of the 3 bulls the first year, the 2 bulls on the second year, excuse me, which basically gave my final cost per head was right around $470 the first year and about $480 this year. So on average, that came out to $475 per head per year to develop those as heifers with a 89% calving rate and then a 95% conception rate as they went 2 to 3 years old. So one of the things that in talking with this with Alex was that our cost per animal isn't that out of line. It's probably fairly close to where we would expect a lot of heifer development costs to be. Where we think that this changes things is our cost per acre. The total pounds of weaned beef per acre is going to increase. And because I pulled those, excuse me, I pulled those calves early, when we started to go through a little bit of our SPA analysis, I didn't have all of the numbers that I would need it. But basically our total dollars per weaned calf, our cost on that was $510 per calf. Our total cost per exposed female was just under $460 for the first year as a heifer, just under $480 as she went from a 2-year-old to a 3-year-old. Even with that early weaning, one of the SPA numbers, the strategic performance analysis that we do on all the cattle owners in the tribe, one of the things we love to look at is the total pounds of beef raised per acre. With 2 animals per acre, even weaning those early, I think I crushed that number with a 357 pounds of beef per acre. We know if we could have carried those longer, we would have seen that number increase dramatically. And again, we aren't able to have the data for 2019 yet. Those cows that were bred, they've all gone back to the St. Thomas Ranch, or they went to the St. Thomas Ranch for the tribe. So they've just re-entered the commercial herd. Again, I've talked a little bit. That was one of the reasons why I wanted to early wean. That I had 4 paddocks before, I think it was probably October. I mowed 2 of the paddocks, and then I left 2 of the paddocks standing. The smut grass that had turned brown, I let it stand. I was just curious to see if there was going to be a big advantage for regrowth of that smut grass in the wintertime or not. And I don't think there was much of a difference. The grass, very little grass was growing through January. We were very dry there, and we didn't see a lot of difference between what we had done. Kind of our unforeseen results, things that we hadn't expected, was we have Bahia grass coming back into the pasture at an exceptional rate. We have white clover that is coming back. White clover had been in that field well before it was called Pasture X. It had been smothered by the smut grass. The smut grass had blocked off the sun, the air, had been outcompeted a lot of those things for the resources, water, nutrients. And we've also seen a lot of common Bermuda coming back. So there's just a picture of one of the first, this was 2 years ago. We were riding through the pasture, and the cattle foreman from Big Cypress at the time, said, hit the brakes. And I did. We jumped out, and he said, look at all of this Bahia seed head. And we had just rotated the cows off of that paddock, but you can see the Bahia seed head was there. The smut grass in the background is trimmed pretty short, as well as the rest of the Bahia. But we have seen kind of the term I've used to shake people up was Bahia grass encroachment. That will probably have to move out some of my numbers because I'm getting too much Bahia grass back into my smut grass. We have seen this white clover come back. We're really excited to see that. I think from a soil structure perspective, I'm not a soil scientist. I spend half my time doing 4-H programming, but I would say I really believe that we've seen improvement in soil health, having the recycling of nutrients in a smaller acreage, both from the urine and the feces. I believe my soil health has gone up. I don't have any real way to track that. And so when I've gone around and talked to different folks, I've met some folks that said they'd like to come and look at this. And I said, come on, if they're a soil scientist, I would love to be able to see what's going on there. But we've been excited about some of the things we've seen. And finally, I just want to kind of finish with 2 thoughts. One is that we will be putting together the economic analysis of what this has done versus the tribal heifer programs. I think the best way to compare yourself on numbers is to kind of look at your neighbor and see what their costs are. So as I was finishing up this PowerPoint last night, Alex John said, well, why didn't we have the costs of the tribal programs heifers in contrast to the competitive rotational grazing? And I just hadn't had time to put that together. but I think that's something that as people would like to look at that, it's going to let folks compare apples to apples and see if there was a real advantage to this on anything other than the cost per acre. And so I know we're going to have a grazing management class that'll actually be hosted in Brighton in September. Do you remember what that date is? September 4? Okay. I was going to say 19, but so it's sometime in September. I'll find that out today and make sure that Brent mentions it again. But we will have, part of that will be a tour out to Pasture X, and at that point in time, we'll have those 80 heifers out there in the competitive rotational environment. And then finally, I really feel like that as I know some of you are going to kill smutgrass, and at the Cattlemen's Association this year, I sat with a lot of people and talked about what I was doing. And I said, we don't want to stop that. When it's economically viable for a rancher to treat and kill smutgrass, we understand that. This was just something that we felt like, from the tribe's perspective, we have looked at different ways to kill smutgrass, and given the environment, given the conditions that it was, we felt like we were going to explore kind of an outside of the box avenue to this. So I really think that a lot of folks, this doesn't fit everybody, and I wouldn't say it would even come close, but the tribe had tried a lot of things, and this was the avenue that we felt like could make sense for some of our producers. So I'm all in favor. I've got a weed wiper. I know the value of that, but I also know that there's value if once you make a management decision to have some resources and some recommendations on what happens next. So that's all I've got. If anybody has any questions, or if Brent Sellers tells me to get away from here, I'll be completely done. Yes, sir.
How frequently do you have to mow to make this palatable?
I am a believer that the least amount of mowing, I mow once a year in the spring for thistle control and pigweed control. And then the other part of this was about reducing input costs and letting the cow do the work. When I had someone say, well, I love to mow smutgrass, and I kind of laughed because nobody really loves to mow smutgrass. I said, I really love having cows eat it. And so that was the idea with the 2 cows per acre. During the summer, at 2 cows per acre, they could not keep up with it. We probably could have done 3 or 4 cows to the acre, but we let that stuff get rank, and then they would come back and self-select what they had chewed on, the 3 weeks before. So we mow once a year. I am going to have to mow again before the calves come in July. I actually will have a mower on my first paddock this Friday, and he'll mow 1 paddock because in 21 days those heifer calves are hitting that paddock. So then he'll mow the next paddock the following Friday. But in my goal would be that would be the only time that I would mow it per year if the cows can keep up with it, that we'd like to see them do the work.
What time of year, I know it's in correlation with the staffing, but what time of year would you recommend mowing just?
Man, I think that really, for us, what we did was I let it come up in the spring, and I felt like once my thistles were big and I had a lot of pigweed that was becoming prevalent in some of the areas, I said it's time to mow, and I had some soda apple. So I said for us it was early spring. I wanted to get those thistles down, and I felt like we needed some control of the pigweed and soda apple before they really got out of hand. The other thing that I think if I could do a lot of this over again, and I know I wanted to overmanage. It was only 20 acres, and as a kind of an Iowa farmer, I was like, man, I want to go out there and I want to spot spray thistles, I want to spot spray soda apples, and I had to get backed off of that because it was like we wanted to make sure that if this was applicable, it would be something that a Florida rancher could look at and be realistic. But it was it really the other challenges that we had, with our water situation on a small competitive environment like that. It's a high risk maneuver. If my water pump shuts down when it's 100 degrees out, we've got a real issue. And so the labor side of that, of checking and making sure, depending on how people are structured, there were probably more costs that would have gone into managing that herd and making sure that they were in it, just because of the environment ours were. But yeah, early spring for mowing. All right. Thank you all very much.